on accountability. Sorry, I just want to say, got it on this recording. Thank you. The workshop is around accountability, professionalism, trust, capabilities, all these very, I think, complex constructs around the relationships between capacities, accountabilities, and trust in education environments. And the purpose of the workshop really is for JET and their partners, the Vrije University of Amsterdam and the Open University in the UK, to share their findings from a research study that they undertook in South African primary schools to explore these notions of a trust, accountability, capacity, and professionalism. So the study comprised, I think, surveys and interviews in both high and low performing schools, primary schools. The workshop, therefore, will share these findings from 3 different perspectives or lenses, and in a way will use these through, and this will happen through 3 presentations or papers, if you like, around this area. It'll be quite a tight sort of structure. We'll have 3 presentations, about 10 to 12 minutes each, followed by a short question opportunity. And following that, we'll place people into groups, 3 groups, to follow through around dialoguing and discussing in those various sort of areas around the 3 papers. So on that sort of note, I don't want to take too long to introduce the areas. I'm going to start with the first presenter, and that is Professor Melanie Ahren from the Vrije University of Amsterdam. I hope I'm saying Vrije right. Professor Ahren is an expert on the effectiveness of professionalism and accountability in terms of improving school systems. Her presentation will focus particularly on teacher professionalism and the lens of teacher professionalism and how it builds trust and accountability. So over to you, Professor Ahren. You have between 10 and 12 minutes to present your findings from this study. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima, for this really nice introduction, and well done on pronouncing the Dutch name of my university, which is always a challenge. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about this project. When we started this project around trust, accountability, and capacity building, we were faced with a really huge challenge, because these 3 themes are so incredibly broad that you can capture pretty much everything in thinking about education system reform. So this kind of final session brings together some of our key findings around thematic areas that are really important to think about improving learning outcomes. And teacher professionalism and teacher quality obviously is a highly important area of work to think about when we want to improve education systems. We know from various studies that the quality of teaching is one of the key levers for improving learning outcomes, which is why thinking about professionalism in relation to trust, capacity, and accountability is a really key aspect of this project. Next slide. And this kind of slide also summarizes that, saying that teaching is the one profession that creates all other professions. So that also indicates that it's not just important for kind of short-term learning outcomes of students, but that it's also really important in thinking about progression of a society as a whole, both economically and socially. Next slide. But that does raise the question about what do we actually mean by a profession? And in the field of sociology, this is something that's being discussed and talked about in various literatures. And when we think about a profession, we often think about these two professions. People working in the medical sector, but also people working in law. On the right-hand side, you see Brenda Hale, who was the president of the UK Supreme Court, who ruled the Prime Minister Johnson's action to suspend Parliament in the lead up to the Brexit deadline unlawful. So these two professions and how they enact their profession is kind of some of the examples that we often think about when we think about profession and professionalism. Next slide. But then how does that relate to teaching and teachers? To what extent are teachers actually true professions as we understand them from a more theoretical point of view? And when we look at some of the literature, for example, Vrijtson talks about what are the elements of an ideal type of profession. What does a kind of true profession really look like? And what they talk about is that it's a true profession is highly specialized in the type of work. It requires an expert body of knowledge, that people are trained up in higher education often, but it also requires some autonomy in terms of how to exercise their work as a group of professionals, controlling entry requirements into the profession, such as through a register. And also an underpinning ideology of commitment to doing good rather than working on behalf of a client with the purpose of making profit, or working in a bureaucracy under a state level regulation of what a good profession looks like. So there's a high level of autonomy involved in what constitutes the ideal type of a profession. And then the question that's being raised often is, does the teaching profession meet these requirements? Well, maybe some of them, and maybe some of them are still under development, which is why teaching and teachers are often viewed as a semi-profession. But that will also vary by country and school. Some countries are a bit further in terms of seeing or having teachers as an independent profession, whereas in other countries we would see far more stricter regulation. And then we will also see variation within a system in terms of schools, for example. And this is something I'll be talking about as well a bit later on in this presentation. Next slide. So when we started thinking about teaching and teacher professionalism in South Africa, we looked first of all at the kind of formal context around teaching professionalism and the extent to which the system is currently set up and organized to ensure teacher professionalism. And what we then see is that there are two quite contradictory logics in place. We do see quite a lot of policies that aim to enhance teacher professionalism, such as with SAYS and the kind of institutional provisions they have to register teachers for professional development of teachers, requirements around the IQMS and staff development appraisal, all of the initiatives around professional learning communities in schools. These are all examples of policies that aim to enhance teacher professionalism. But then we also see quite a strong bureaucratic system with hierarchical control, standardization to improve learning outcomes. CAPS is a really key example of that, how it regulates the curriculum and what teachers are expected to do. Post-provisioning process, where teachers are allocated to schools and don't have a kind of autonomy to engage in that process collectively or regulate that process as a teaching professional body. So these are some of the kind of hierarchical control and standardization processes that are really counterintuitive to what teacher professionalism constitutes according to kind of the theoretical framework. Next slide. Can I have the next slide, please? So we also see that teachers' ability and competence and capacity to enact teacher professionalism on the school level is conditioned in these specific features at the school level. So to be able to act professionally and to act as a profession that requires leadership in the school that enables teachers that level of autonomy that is needed to make those decisions collectively. In some of the schools in our study, we've seen that teacher or that school leaders do really allow for that teacher professionalism, where they've put in place a decision-making structures that would allow teachers to collectively make decisions on curriculum, assessment, etc. Within national requirements, but where they would be able to make those decisions collectively. Whereas in other schools, we see quite a high level of what we've called micromanagement and very strict control of what teachers are expected to do on a day-to-day basis. And that kind of level of micromanagement doesn't really allow teachers to act as a profession, because they are just really ordered almost to do, to follow a script, to implement structured lesson plans and account for that, which is really counterintuitive to the level of autonomy and capacity that goes with that as well, that is part of teacher professionalism. We also see that there is quite a large variation in terms of trust within the school, trust relations between teachers in and how that affects whether they are able to collaborate professionally and make decisions together as a group, or schools that are really marked by quite high conflict between teachers, and where teachers are talking about cliques, where there's really no collaboration. Teachers come into the school, close their door, and don't really share good practice, review each other's practice, and think about how to improve learning across the school collectively. So again, quite a distinct practice across schools. And this also is related to the mindset of teachers. We have asked teachers in the schools in our study how they understand accountability. And it's quite interesting to see some of the responses that we get, which are really, which really vary on a continuum from, on the one hand, following a script, doing what I'm being told to do, versus talking about responsibility and taking responsibility for student learning. And particularly the second kind of understanding is what resonates with the kind of teacher professionalism and working for the public good that we have described earlier as one of the key features of teacher professionalism. And then also the wider context is really important here in terms of positive community engagement, having resources in the school that would actually allow for having professional conversations. Sometimes teachers are really pressed for time, so there is not really an opportunity to engage in those professional conversations. Or schools are really geographically isolated and don't have an opportunity to work with other schools. So it's also those contextual elements that are really important in thinking about teacher professionalism. I think I leave it there. I have some kind of suggestions for next steps, but it would be good to also discuss these in the small groups a bit later. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Atten. I think that that was, I mean, it's a concerning and sobering input. And I think that if I listen to it, issues around autonomy being very important and professionalism and the extent to which the constructs and conditions in South Africa undermine that is a serious problem. And I think that you know, it will be discussed further in the groups. Let me go to the next speaker. So we're going to have the speakers and we'll have a few minutes at the end if we can sort of keep time. And then if you don't have that, you'll have it in the groups. So the next speaker is Professor Jacqueline Baxter from the Open University in the UK. And Professor Baxter will focus on leadership and the ways in which the kinds of leadership that best enhance trust and accountability in school environments. So I hand over to you, Professor Baxter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So as Melanie's just mentioned, obviously trust is very, very important in schools, as we all know. Can I have the next slide, please? But trust in leadership is extremely important. And it's important because the research shows that it's key to organizational effectiveness, and that it contributes strongly to distrusting school cultures, which inhibit school improvement. And we find, because leadership's quite complex to conceptualize. So within this study, we've conceptualized it as relational forms of leadership, and relational forms of leadership involve the processes that are put together in schools, and also the trust between different levels in schools. So relational trust and relational leadership generally takes a distributed view of leadership, in which leadership is distributed right down the school from the senior leadership team, heads of department, and also, you know, individual teachers or subject specialists as well. And relational trust linked to relational leadership is key to citizenship behaviours in schools, which basically means the type of relationships between school staff that promote school improvement, collegiality and all-round trust. And they also, to come back to what Melanie was saying earlier about teacher professionalism, they contribute to that by providing a climate that's conducive to professional discussion. And a frank admittance of mistakes, and treating mistakes as learning events rather than something to be pushed under the carpet. Leadership in South African schools by most South African leadership scholars is conceptualized as distributed, but there's also quite a lot of evidence in this study and other studies to say that in fact it's still on the ground viewed very much as a charismatic or character-based element or phenomenon. And that basically means that you know, the leadership depends on the charisma of the individual in the senior leadership team who leads the school, in other words, the school principal, and is not conceptualized as particularly distributed. Trust is vital to distributed leadership, as I've just said, And it's particularly vital in areas of high socioeconomic deprivation, as the international research shows, because it increases the potential, the democratic potential of education. And Jan Heestek, a South African, well-known South African academic, talks about the lack of trust between principals, teachers, governing bodies, and the district, which all hinge back to trust in leadership. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by relational trust and relational leadership? Well, relational trust has 5 different elements. It means that are based around relational leadership, and that is that leaders are approachable, empathetic, that they care. It's interactional in that leaders can create open and safe spaces for collaboration, encouraging communities of practice amongst teachers. It's intersubjective. That's a difficult one to break down, but it basically means that they are invested in the change agenda, that they're invested in change and improvement for their school, and that they create a language that is shared with the school staff. The 4th one, and apologies, there's a slight typo on that slide, is intellectual, which means the professional. It comes down to the professional knowledge of the leader, their expertise and their wisdom, the degree to which they are measured and consider when they make decisions. And then the 5th one is pragmatic. In other words, these are the activities that lead professional learning that are practical, relevant, realistic and achievable for schools and their staff. Next slide, please. So we based this study, this particular analysis, around the expectations of leadership and the perceptions of staff in relation to leadership and trust in leadership. So that's quite important to mention, because this is a study that's founded on staff perception. And of course, perception is very important in relation to trust, because people create their own environments. If they don't perceive the leadership to be trustworthy, then the leadership in effect is not trustworthy, because that then interacts in terms of the trust relationship between leaders and their staff. The sample was the sample for the project, 4 high-performing and 4 low-performing schools. There were 84 respondents from across school groups in the low-performing schools, and the high-performing schools, there were 129. And for the background data on how we chose that, you can refer to the case study report on the JET website. We identified in this study 31 elements that detracted from trust in leadership, and 29 that contributed to trust in leadership. And we were able to break those down into several elements. So social aspects, unions, parents, governing body, efficacy and integrity. Personal attributes of the leadership team, they did come through quite strongly as being important. Procedural aspects, culture, perceptions of accountability, the perceptions of corruption within school, if there were any, and finally, communication. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there were 31 key factors detracting from trust in leadership, and I'm not going to read through them all because you can see them there, and I will make this available at some point on the JET website. There were some that really came out quite strongly though, and if we go to just for example number 9, people mentioned a cozy relationship between principals and unions, leading to nepotism of the principal, who favoritizes members of the same union. That might not be true. it is a perception of the teachers. So therefore, in terms of trust, it's really important. I just want to emphasize that because there is that tension between, well, are these things true or not, or is it a perception? And in terms of the research that we did, it's a perception, and that's why it impedes trust to such an extent, whether it happens to be true or not. For example, teaching is seen as a covering of curriculum by the principal and the head of department. So the feeling that there is a lack there of real investment in learner development. It's just a rolling out of the curriculum, which is something that Melanie mentioned in her presentation as well. Poor communication featured quite highly as well. And there were perceptions of a poor attitude to monitoring by the principal as well. So this is where we come into the relationship, the relational conceptualization of leadership, which looks, as I said in the first instance, not only to the individual's power to lead, but also onto the processes, into the processes that leader creates, and the processes within the school that lead to a well-run school. And there was a perception that some principals in the study just weren't putting in place those monitoring processes with the right intent behind them. So there were processes to monitor, but the processes were perceived as unreliable, biased, non-productive to the development of teacher autonomy, identity, and feelings of agency or effectiveness by teachers. Can we have the next slide, please? There were 29 factors contributing to trust in leadership. And I think perhaps rather, as we're viewing this with a view to the future, I think they're perhaps more important to focus on than the detractors. So we had some, again, I'm not going to read them out, but you are very welcome to have a copy of this after the event. We have factors such as, number one, fairness and transparent decision-making processes, conflicts dealt with through open discussions, culturally inclusive practices. Number four is rather strange, isn't it? Rejection of non-white learners. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the discussion group, because that pertained to schools that had a particular cultural bias in terms of the senior leadership team. So I'll talk, as I say, about that in the discussion group because it's complex. A robust internal system of accountability. This too was complex, but basically meant that there was a perception that the internal system of accountability aligned with teachers' professional values, aligned with the teacher values of care for pupils, and that the systems of accountability were seen to be building that relationship of care and promoting it. As well as encouraging high academic results. Discretion and confidentiality amongst the leadership team and the heads of department, that was thought to be very, very important indeed. And in cases where that confidentiality was thought to be lacking, for example, in cases where there was seen to be partiality in relation or favoritism between the senior leader and a particular head of department or particular teachers, then of course that trust was then undermined. Some things we would have expected: a strong discipline policy supported by all heads of department and the principal. And the number 17, the leader models a sense of individual responsibility and accountability. Again, coming back rather to that charismatic stroke transformational conceptualization of leadership, which is thought by many not to be so appropriate for the South African context anymore. I'll talk about that on the next slide. So lots of different contributors to leadership, which are very, very important to staff. So to sum up, really, what we found in this paper was that strong middle leaders did not compensate for weak senior leadership. So where weak senior leadership was occurring, there was a vacuum, and those strong middle leaders who were trying to do their best for the school still were not able to compensate for that weak leadership, and the lack of trust by staff for that weak leadership. The study also found that there was evidence of a vacuum in leadership leading to overdependence on the district or the union. And so in some cases, and this was particularly the case in low-performing schools, there was a very high dependence on the union or the district, both for professional development, but also for basic problem resolution. So stuff that was going to the should have gone to the head teacher was actually going straight through to the union or to the district. Some factors promoting trust also detracted from it, i.e. race and culture. And that point that I said I would come back to was quite featured quite strongly in one particular school, where the school leadership team and the heads of department were of one particular culture, and the teachers came from another racial background. And we found some quite worrying statements there, which, as I say, I'll discuss in the smaller group. A lack of trust in the leadership. It supports a lack of trust in the accountability system. You can't, you know, NACO and Mestri found in 2011 that the two things were simply, you can't have an effective accountability, professional accountability, if there's no trust in the leadership. This study supported their work, which was carried out in 2011. On a theoretical basis, we found it was problematic to conceptualize leadership as distributed in this particular study. We found more evidence of charismatic and transformational leadership within this particular study. However, it is constrained. You know, that shouldn't be taken. It shouldn't be taken to be wider than it is, than the research that we carried out. But what we are saying is, in this particular instance, and in relation to trust, that charismatic, transformational type of leader, senior leader, was seen to be important. And we also found that the evidence undermined any evidence of distributed leadership. A couple of the schools were simply not mature enough in terms of their systems to have that distributed leadership. Unions provide professional development where it is lacking from schools, and they also provide trust in a trust vacuum. But there was no evidence for the intersubjective view of relational trust either. And the intersubjective, just to remind you, was where leaders create the shared language, productive problem resolution, and investment in change agenda. We would have had to have carried out more detailed, granular work in an ethnographic study in order to prove or disprove that particular phenomenon. And I think that is where my presentation finishes. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Baxter. I think that the first presentation focused a lot on teachers and teacher professionalism. We come to the second one, which is really about the leadership, the nature of leadership and the importance of such leadership in building accountability. So trust in leadership is crucial, senior leadership is crucial, and distributive leadership is also something that we need to work towards. However, this study raised a range of detractors and contributors around what it takes to build trust in leadership, which is also important. And I think there will be quite a robust discussion in the groups. So now we move on to the next group, and that group is really the JET team. It's Andrew Patterson and Zahida Valley, and they are focusing on notions of trust and trust relationships within, amongst the school community, between teachers and parents, caregivers, etc. And it's the relationship between the school and the community in a sense, and what trust may or may not look like in South African schools in the studies that they undertook. So over to you, Andrew and Zahida. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Fatima. We're really quite excited to make this presentation. In this case, our work involves looking more closely at the parent-teacher relationship that we have decided we would like to push a bit further. Since this project as a whole focuses at a systems level, we felt that this is one strategic area that is worth looking into in a bit more detail. In order to do that, what we are doing is utilizing data that we have, that is data from 4 case studies of schools in Gauteng, to get a deeper sense of the kinds of relationships that are taking place in terms of trust and accountability between parents and teachers. Perhaps also to say that we use the word parent as a shorthand. This is because in many homes, parents are perhaps either just one parent, 2 parents, or there are no biological parents in the home, so that there is a lot of variation in the adult availability of parents or caregivers in the household, especially where people are working. So can we go to the next slide, please? So our presentation really has 2 halves. The first half is to give some background and context to why we're looking at this aspect. And then the other half focuses on themes for discussion. This is themes that have come out of our work. And that will be discussed with you by my co-author, co-presenter, Zahida. Perhaps we could move to the next slide, please. So as you well know, this work comes from the project that we are all involved with. It is a 5-year project, and so it is also, for that matter, a living project. And given that there are questions that have arisen out of the project, this is one of the reasons why we are pushing a little bit further and trying to mine the data better to get an understanding of, of the trust capacity and accountability relationships. But also to say that when one talks about parental participation, people use different terminology or words: participation, engagement, collaboration, involvement. And these are important to make note of because they might imply different capabilities and different understandings of what positive parent involvement might mean. So as we've indicated, this is based on some case studies in one province, the Gauteng province. What we know from the literature is, well, a lot more about how difficult it is to understand this relationship, as is suggested by one of the authors in this space, Sibanda, but then also Munje and Ngube. They both refer to the difficulties involved in the space because it does seem to be so very complex. So what we are trying to do is tease out some of these complexities in just one part of the broad domain of the project. Can we have the next slide, please? So what we want to refer to first is for context, but also for a better understanding, a perspective on people's approach to the involvement of parents. So we go back to the National Education Policy Act, which specifies three main things that a parent needs to do that is part of their duty, and that is to ensure that their children do attend school. But in addition to that, not only that, to be involved in their child's education in the home. And this would mean a variety of activities around checking on, speaking to, encouraging especially their children or to the children in the household, but then also to attend parent-teacher meetings. And this is specified given the importance allocated to democratic participation in our school governing bodies. So in this broad domain, what has been happening? What do we see regarding this set of duties that is coming out of the case law of the legal processes? And it does seem that from what the courts are seeing, that there is a need from that evidence for parents to become more actively involved in the education of the children. And this is an important fact. This is an important addition to our understanding of the radical importance of parents' involvement. But perhaps the most important thing is to recognize, it is recognized that a clear legal standard that defines the parameters of parental accountability is not available. And in a way, this is really unsurprising, since we don't believe that legislation or regulation would sufficiently take care of these difficulties. So how else do we understand this challenge? The one way of looking at it is to see what in the literature appear to be some of the approaches taken to dealing with and to improving relationships and strengthening trust and accountability. But a lot of the inputs have come from the perspective of need for more information, need for better communication. And what we think our project does is it adds value by drawing us back to understanding the importance of relationships between parents and teachers. Could we have the next slide, please? So the next slide provides just a very basic schematic diagram of which represents the school as an institution and parents who are on the periphery. After all, it is in our society that teachers and parents are the largest two groups that deal on a daily basis with their children or their scholars' progress at schools. And what we need to bear in mind here is that on the school side, these systems of developing trust and accountability at an institutional level are far stronger than for parents. And this is an important juxtaposition to bear in mind. Not that we can assume that because of the structures inside of schools, inside of primary schools, that these will inevitably play a very strong role on trust and accountability. So perhaps we can then move to the next slide, please. So bearing in mind these as the general issues, the general context within which we might approach relationships, how teachers and parents relate to each other. And of course, there are always examples of good relationships and of relationships that could be improved. And these occur across all of our schools. And especially since we are referring to case studies, we wouldn't be able to generalize, but we are able to pick up indicators of the different kinds of relationships and struggles for teachers and parents to interact better between each other. So just to bear in mind also that our study, it focused on 4 primary schools, as I've indicated, with about 10 to 13 interviews per school, and which included the teachers, the school governing body, the school management team, the principal, a union rep, and the circuit manager. The bulk of those interviews were with teachers in grade 6 and grade 3 in the language and mathematics literacy space in primary schools. Also to bear in mind that the schools were selected on the basis of their being located in quintile 5 and in quintile 1, which are the categories used to indicate socioeconomic status, socioeconomic level of our communities. So these would reflect the 2 ends of the spectrum. And also the schools were located in rural, urban, township, and peri-urban locations in order to capture some of that diversity as well. And lastly, just to mention that those, I'm sorry about that, just to mention that the perspectives are mainly from school stakeholders, except where there were 2 parent representatives on the SGB. So may I hand over to Zayda now for to take us through the themes. Thanks, Zayda.
Thanks so much, Andrew, and hi to everyone. So I'm just going to take you through some of the themes that we identified in our study. And really briefly, I mean, there's a lot to report on, but I'm just going to touch on each one really briefly. So the first one is with regards to the capacity of parents or caregivers more generally in the household. Andrew really mentioned that many of the households are headed by single parents. We also found households headed by grandparents or other caregivers. And we found that they frequently did not respond to requests to come into the school to discuss their child's work or behavior. And this was due to a variety of reasons. As a result, we also found that schools won't really be willing to give learners much homework because parents provided really limited support to learners at home. There was also a bit of displaced responsibility reported from the teacher's side that parents felt it's the teacher's job, to teach the child, and why should they get involved in the learner's education. And just the last point around the capacity was education levels. So where there were lower levels of education among the parents, they were often mixed with feelings of fear and inadequacy amongst the teachers. So they wouldn't really be willing to interact with the teachers when it came to their child's education. The next point is around parents' trust in teachers. So overall, what we found were that trust levels were not really high. Again, Andrew did mention that there were case studies, so they were really specific context, and we can't make blanket statements regarding all of the case studies, but in general, we found that the trust levels were not really high. We also found that parents from more affluent backgrounds did not really seem to trust in teachers' capacity. And then we found less affluent parents didn't have a good enough trust relationship with their teachers or with the teachers of their children to go directly to the teachers with any matters with regards to behavior, academic matters. And instead, then they chose to go directly to principals with whatever issues that they had on hand. The third one that we found was communication and language matters. Again, more affluent schools seem to use communication platforms such as social media, WhatsApp, and that sort of thing to keep in touch with parents, because I guess those resources are available to them in order to do that. But we found where parents' education levels were slightly low, then communication was not as regular, and this was due to a number of things. So, for example, newsletters would not reach the parents, this in part due to learners not giving it to their parents, but also when it did reach them, they weren't really responsive to it. And again, there's low literacy associated with that, and that posed then language barriers. We also found where parents were from outside of South Africa, so foreigners living in South Africa, they struggled with local languages, and that hindered their ability to communicate with the schools that the learners attended. Another theme that we found was teachers' understanding of parent challenges. Again, here social class played quite an important role. So parents of different social classes to that of the teachers felt that the teachers couldn't really understand them and understand the challenges that they faced. We also found that when teachers were from outside of the schooling community, that means they didn't live in nearby neighborhoods, parents were also very apprehensive when it came to their perception of teachers really understanding what they went through on a day-to-day basis. And then the last one that we found was interventions undertaken to improve engagement. So there were regular parent meetings in some of the schools, and then there were also mentions of workshops from the circuit or the district level to improve parental engagement, although these were ad hoc. So the results of these, we couldn't really, they couldn't really be, tied down very firmly because it wasn't happening very regularly. So it was a bit difficult to really ascertain whether it was having much of a effect or not. And so this is one of the things that we'd really like to discuss in the group discussion shortly around some interventions that could be taken to improve both capacity and trust. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew and Zahida. I think that we are about 5 minutes over time for the sort of plenary presentations. So I'm not going to allow questions and comments, but if you can post your questions into the chat, that will be quite helpful, because maybe at the end we can get some of the experts to comment. But I'd like to sort of send you off to the groups. Just to recap, there'll be 3 groups. One is really focusing on teacher professionalism and its relationship to accountability and capacity, etc. The other is about leadership, distributive leadership, detractors and contributors, etc. And the third is about the school relationship, school community relationship, particularly relationship between parents and teachers. Unfortunately, you will be randomly assigned to the groups, so you're gonna have to deal with that. Yeah, so over to the team that's going to put people into groups, and then you'll have 15 minutes. You'll automatically be sent back to the session to the plenary for some feedback on the group works and hopefully possibilities to make a few comments and ask some questions at the end. Thank you. Over to you, please.
Can see my breakout group joining, which is great because I pressed leave breakout group a bit too early. Maybe I can kind of finish my reflections before everyone else joins, but I was just going to say that we often see that middle management also has a teaching role, and school management teams also have teaching roles. So the kind of leadership role sometimes also kind of converge. Another time to discuss.
I think we probably have a minute or two, Melanie, as
Okay.
people come back.
Yes. Thank you. Are we all back? Almost back, hey? Just want to see. James, can you just guide me? How many people are back?
You're good to go, Fatima. We've got just over 20 people back, and you've got about
Okay.
18,
Okay.
19 minutes left.
Okay, so I think we must just get quick feedback from the different groups. I'm going to start with Melanie because her presentation was first. So let's go for you. You've got a few minutes, probably 5, to feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think I need the full 5 minutes because there was quite a strong kind of main theme coming through the discussions in our small group, which is really that mindset of teachers is a really important one if we want to improve teacher professionalism in South Africa. And what was really interesting to me thinking about this is that when we talked about mindset in our study, we talked about mindset in relation to how people understand accountability, whether they take responsibility or not. But the discussions in our small group also were about whether teachers feel that they have the capacity or the professionalism even to be a teacher, whether they have the skills, the knowledge, the expertise to teach well. That's a bit different than the mindset around accountability. This is really the mindset around professionalism and being a professional. And that is also relevant for whether they are particularly talking about problems in the system or also feel that they have a role to look for solutions, to look for professional development and all the opportunities that are available online. So to be able to develop capacity of teachers, you need to almost start with changing their mindsets to ensure that they feel responsible and take responsibility for their further development. I'll leave it with that.
Thank you very much. I think I must get feedback from group 2, which is Professor Jacqueline Baxter. Thank you. Professor Baxter, over to you.
Thank you. Well, we were quite provocative in our group, really. We posed more questions than we answered. And I think in relation to distributed leadership, if distributed leadership is the ideal in order for teachers to feel professional and to be able to rise to leadership positions, both senior leadership and middle leadership, then has the top-down curriculum actually worked in achieving that? And I think in relation to what Melanie's just said, I think leadership starts with the teachers, because it's the teachers' perceptions of the leadership that matter, but also teacher ability to move up the ranks is vitally important in order to get that, to break down the barrier between the senior leader as this charismatic kind of character, transformational character, who takes all the responsibility for transformation in the school, and the distributed model where everybody takes responsibility for the transformation and the improvement in the school. And I think it starts with the teacher. So yeah, we asked, has the top-down curriculum actually worked? Yes, there's got to be a curriculum, but is this particular version of the curriculum actually working in creating the kind of educational establishments that South Africa wants and needs at the present time? And also, in relation to that, just one other point, really, if you're going to make schools responsible, if you're going to engender that degree of professional responsibility within schools and break down that hierarchy which turns leaders into charismatic people with rather sort of hidden skills or rather magical almost skills, what do we need to be doing in relation to ongoing teacher CPD, but also ongoing leadership CPD as well, because it did appear through our sample that some of these leaders were seeing themselves as transformational and charismatic. And whilst that's all very well, of course, then you have a problem, because when that individual moves on, then the school collapses. And as several of colleagues in our session pointed out, there is quite a lot of churn within South African primary schools. So really, as I say, asked more questions than we answered, but a couple of very interesting questions, I think, there for future research.
Thank you. Quickly over to Andrew and Zahida.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Please excuse the visual. I'm using my mobile phone as a torch because the Roman end is quite dark under load shedding. But just to say, a number of themes, of perspectives came out, one of them being that the nature of the school has been changing here in South Africa. Our colleague suggested that the school has been seen as a house or a home, but that seems to have flagged as a way of understanding the school. And this has affected the relationship between the teachers and parents and the community. But also social change and continuity in social change is also part of this story. So in our group, we were being drawn to understanding the bigger picture of social change, and also the changing role of teachers, the changing status, of teachers in the society. So this was also seen, and also by implication that draws us to the self-perception of teachers and how they themselves understand their role. In relation to that, another theme was very, how can I say, we were encouraged to think more with more empathy and with more understanding about teachers and the role that they are playing. We didn't delve into that in any detail, but that could, of course, refer to the material circumstances in schools, but also to other kinds of pressures on teachers in a large system, which seems to be struggling to an extent with its ability to provide quality to all. And then, of course, the emphasis on understanding very specifically the link between the school and the household, and how households could be understood as the basis, and not just a parent, could be understood as a basis for that link. So, so those are the main things that came up. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Look, we don't have a lot of time. I'm going to just try and summarize a little bit about the things that I think are important. And then if we do, maybe I'd like James to say a few words around, where to from here. So the first for me is about the binding constraints that we have in South African context to build notions of professionalism and professional accountability, to build trust in leadership, and to foster parental involvement. And we know that all of those are affected in different ways. There seems to be a kind of set of forces in the South African context that militate against fostering, improved relationships with parents, improved trust in leadership and professionalism, compliance cultures, blame cultures, performativity cultures, bureaucratic cultures, etc., issues of politics, race and class. And then to say that all of this sort of results in an environment which have low accountability, low capability, low trust, low autonomy. And the thing is, these factors feed into each other in a vicious cycle. One leads to the other, which affects the other, because if you don't have high levels of capability, then there's no trust, then there's no account, it starts to kind of foster this vicious cycle, and we need to take it to a virtuous cycle, whatever that may mean in this way. This vicious cycle seems to feed off each other in ways that are very difficult to find solutions. We need to find some of the leverage points to undo some of this kind of trajectory that we've been on. And then just to say that it seems as if I've heard that there's a differentiated problems, that the problems are not the same across the schools, depending on where they come from, the poverty quintiles, etc. And so maybe we need to start thinking about solutions that are better responsive to the contexts and differentiated approaches. We need to also think of multi-pronged approaches, because you can see we need to work at the parental communication, relationship building level. We need to work at the level of professional development, professional trust, all of that, and the leadership. So we have to come in at multi-levels. In addition, we have to come into multiple approaches because of the differences in our schools. And then finally, just to leave you with a thought. In order to get the system going, the state put into place what I would say is quite a high bureaucratic response, high structured response. Therefore, we've got scripted curriculum, we've got caps, etc. And the intention was to get some social justice, because schools that were in the poorer quintiles were actually not completing curriculum. So and they were not able to take the curriculum as far as it needed to go. So then came in a lot of top-down prescription. And I think that this sort of militates against what everybody's been saying around, a culture of distributive leadership, a culture of professionalism, etc. And I think we need to think about how we balance these, because if we move the pendulum to say no curriculum, everybody does their own thing, everybody trusts teachers, teachers have got expertise, none of that is completely true in and of themselves. And so we need to think about a fair balance around this structured notion versus a kind of more open notion that builds autonomy, professionalism, and accountability. Before I close, I'd like to just give James a few minutes to round off and tell us a little bit about where we're going to take this project.
Thanks,
Over
Fatima.
to you, James.
Thanks, Fatima and colleagues. I'm reminded, Melanie and Jacqueline, when we first met, what's about 5 years ago in Bloomsbury, and where we started and how the world has changed in 5 years. Massive. From Ukraine to South Africa. I mean, as South Africans, we just had load shedding now. So we're just sitting in a place. That's why Andrew looks like a ghost today, because, we've just had load shedding. So things are changing so quickly in our countries. And I don't know, I fear for what the politicians are doing to our countries, but let's stick to our research and the facts that we are starting to find. There's something about accountability in education, which you have helped us explore in a more empirical way, that I think is so foundational for the work that we need to take forward, not only in South Africa, but in many countries. And so I think the challenge to us, Fatima, you asked for us as a research team, but as an ecosystem, what are we going to do with these findings? Sure, we can publish in journals and those things are important, but there's something about systemic change here, which we need to take to our government department, to our unions, to our professional body. And I think there's something, that this is not anecdotal. This is actual empirical evidence. And while it's a case study approach, and Jacqueline, your point is right. Yes, we need more ethnographical studies to deepen this. Yes, all of that. We've actually got real scientific evidence here to start with maybe a relatively small sample, but the work has been done in a very solid way. So Fatima, if you ask me what's next, I think what's next is for us to engage the DBE in particular, to engage SACE and the unions, and to try and really see how we can utilize this research as we go forward. So that will be our main takeaway, and Jet is willing to kind of put our necks on the block to move this ahead with Jacqueline and Melanie. I think overall, the important thing for us as researchers is to continue making a difference where we can, but not to just move on to the next thing, and this report just gathers dust. So I think there's a commitment from our side as Jet to move this forward. And this was a small group today. We didn't go too wide with attendance today. We wanted to just kind of group this, see what the uptake is like. But watch the space. There's quite a bit more coming in this area. So just thanks again. Thanks to DFID as well for funding this over many years. For Melanie, for your leadership. It's been fantastic. I've been a bit of an arm's length around this, but I hope one day we can work a bit closer together. You've been really intellectually so sound and so strong, and it's been good for our team to work with you. And the same for you, Jacqueline. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I always talk to Andrew and Zeta around this kind of stuff and the rest of the team. It's been a good experience for us. So this is not the end of the line. Watch the space. There's more going to come. Thanks to Tima for chairing today, and thanks for everybody for offering your time. We've tried to make it relatively seamless. I don't think it was perfect, but we've tried our best to make it as seamless as we could. So bear with us. Watch the space. There's more going to come from this research, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, James. I think that we've tried to keep time, and I know we didn't have enough engagement, but that's always the case with such deep, multi-pronged, multi-leveled, and very, very complex concepts. I hope that Jet can engage further with the DBE and other stakeholders, and we can deepen our understanding of the space with a view to finding solutions for South African schools. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for organizing.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, let me run downstairs so I can finish going.
Thank you, Fatima, for helping us out today.
It's a pleasure, James. I think it was tight, but I think and it's complex. Yeah, but I think you guys got some interesting stuff there. It would be nice if you write it up in kind of like a short few pages, so it can go out meaningfully, because you've got a lot of studies and reports, and it's dense. So that would be nice. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
We must think about kind of getting some traction on the findings. We had like at most 30 people today, so it's been quite low.
Yes.
Yeah. So we must think about maybe re-strategizing how interesting. The topic I thought might attract more people, but it didn't.
I think it's a very specialized field, and I think that South Africa's busy focusing on the technical aspects. So it's